Welcome to BK Academy of Chess. The Queen's Gambit declined is characterized by the moves d4, d5, c4, instead of d takes c4. A common response by black is e6. This is known as the Orthodox Line, which is usually assumed when referring to the Queen's Gambit declined. It can be reached by a number of different move orders, such as c4, e6, knight c3, d5, d4, or knight f3, d5, c4, e6, d4, and so forth. Playing e6 releases black's dark squared bishop, while blocking in his light squared bishop. By declining white's temporary pawn sacrifice, black sets up a solid position. The pawns on d5 and e6 give black a foothold in the center. The Queen's Gambit declined is highly respected as being one of black's most reliable defenses to d4. White will try to exploit black's weak light squared bishop, and black will try to find a useful role for the bishop or trade it. After d takes c4, black will allow white to gain a stronghold in the center in return for some type of compensation, usually in the form of gaining a tempo, by capturing on c4. But only after white has first played bishop d3. In the Orthodox Line, the fight for the tempo revolves around white's efforts to play all other useful developing moves prior to playing bishop d3, d5, c4, e6, knight c3. Other third moves are also possible. C takes d5 may be played to lead to the exchange line. Knight f3 keeps options open, and g3 will transpose to the Catalan. Black's main move is knight f6, though he has other options such as c6. Now the semi-Slav defense may be reached via knight f3, knight f6, though e4, d takes e4, knight takes e4, bishop b4, bishop d2, queen takes d4, bishop takes b4, queen takes e4, bishop e2, leads to sharp play, and knight f3, d takes c4, is the not-a-boom variation, also sometimes known as the Abraham's variation. If black is willing to accept an isolated d pawn, he can play c5. This leads to a variation of the Queen's Gambit declined called the Tarrasch defense. Bishop e7. The a la Tortsev variation. This usually transposes to positions arising from knight f6, and has the advantage from black's standpoint of avoiding the pressure of the main lines in the exchange variation arising after knight f6. C takes d5, e takes d5, bishop g5, with an annoying pin. Bishop e7. White will now usually play c takes d5, e takes d5, bishop f4, c6, e3, when bishop f5, g4, became popular when Mikhail Botvinnik used it in his 1963 title match versus Tigran Petrosian. Bishop b4. Confusing a Nimzo-Indian with a Queen's Gambit, also known as the Berg defense. White has at least two good continuations, queen a4, knight c6, knight f3, where black is forced to block the c-pawn with the knight, and a3, bishop takes c3, b takes c3, and white has the bishop pair almost for free, since c takes d5 is unstoppable and there are no doubled pawns to serve as compensation. The old lines beginning with d4, d5, c4, e6, knight c3, knight f6, can transpose. White has several ways of dealing with black. Main variations of Queen's Gambit declined: bishop g5, bishop e7, knight f3. The Tartakower, Makhaganov, Bondarevsky system h6, bishop h4, castle, e3, b6, is one of the most solid continuations for black. The anti-Tartakower, Makhaganov, Bondarevsky h6, bishop takes f6, bishop takes f6, was extensively tested in the 1980s by Kasparov and Karpov. To this day black has no problems in this line. The Lasker defense: castle, e3, h6, bishop h4, knight e4, bishop takes e7, queen takes e7, is also solid, often leading to the exchange of two sets of minor pieces. It was this line that Viswanathan Anand chose in the final game of the World Chess Championship 2010 in order to defeat Veselin Topalov for the World Championship. The orthodox defense, castle. e3. Knight bd7. Rook c1. c6. And now white has two main moves, bishop d3. And queen c2. After bishop d3. D takes c4. Bishop takes c4. Black allows white to gain a stronghold in the center, and though black's position is somewhat cramped, white loses a tempo by playing bishop d3. Before bishop takes c4. White will try to use his advantage in space to attack, whereas black will try to counter by striking back at the center. Capablanca's freeing maneuver knight e5. Bishop takes e7. Queen takes e7. Castle. Knight takes c3. Rook takes c3. e5. D takes e5. Knight takes e5. Knight takes e5. Queen takes e5. f4. Queen e7. Was once so frequently played that it has a separate code D69 in Encyclopedia of Chess Openings. Though the lack of active counterplay for black, this line has faded out for the time being. The Cambridge Springs defense was introduced more than a century ago and is still played. Bishop g5. Knight bd7. Setting up the elephant trap. e3. c6. Knight f3. Queen a5. Now black intends bishop b4. And possibly knight e4. With pressure along the a5, e1 diagonal. This defense is popular among amateurs because there are several traps white can fall into, for example knight d2. One of the main lines, countering black's pressure along the diagonal. Bishop b4. Queen c2. Castle. And here bishop d3. Loses since d takes c4. Is threatening queen takes g5. Bishop takes f6. C takes d3. As wish and zug. Queen takes d3. Knight takes f6. Wins a piece for black. In the exchange variation c takes d5. E takes d5. Bishop g5. c6. Queen c2. White gains a pawn majority in the center, black is a pawn majority on the queen side. This pawn structure gives white the opportunity to either advance his pawns in the center by means of knight ge2. f3. Followed by the e2, e4 push, or play for a minority attack by means of the plan rook b1. Followed by b2, b4, b5, then b takes c6. In order to create a weak pawn at c6. While black can play c takes b5, or a capture on c6 with a piece, each of these possibilities are even less desirable than the backward pawn in the open file. For black, the exchange at d5 has released his light-squared bishop and opened the e-file, giving him the use of e4 used for central and kingside play. While chances are balanced, black is usually more or less forced to use his superior activity to launch a piece attack on white's king, as the long-term chances in the Queen's Gambit declined exchange structure favor white. The Regzin variation knight f3. Bishop b4. An important line in this variation is the Vienna variation where the game continues. Bishop g5. D takes c4. e4. White occupies the central squares in exchange for long-term pawn structure weaknesses. And there you have it, the Queen's Gambit declined. Thanks for tuning in to BK Academy of Chess, where together we build, and over the board we even the score.